welcome everyone to this week's seminar in the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences at UW. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Brian Harvey. I'm an assistant professor in SEFS here. And it is an absolute honor and privilege to introduce and welcome our seminar speaker, guest today, Dr. Kathy Whitlock, coming to us from Montana State University. It really is not every day that you get to meet, let alone introduce in a seminar series one of your science heroes, and for me, Kathy is one of those people, for certain. Ever since I started learning about fire ecology and ecological resilience, Dr. Whitlock is someone who I've looked up to with tremendous respect and admiration for the work that she's done and how it's shaped the field that I and a lot of my colleagues work in. Dr. Whitlock is a Regents Professor in Earth Sciences at Montana State University and is a fellow of the Montana Institute on Ecosystems, which she founded. Her research interests include past climate change and paleoecology, with a focus on vegetation, fire, and climate history. She's nationally and internationally recognized for her scholarly contributions and leadership activities in the field of past climatic and environmental change, where she has published over 200 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters on this topic, and through her well-funded paleoecology lab, has mentored a total of 37 graduate students and 7 postdocs, many of whom we now recognize as international leaders in this field themselves. So it's a pretty impressive track record. Her record has also been recognized through a long list of awards and accolades, among which I just want to highlight some of the few recent ones. In 2014, she received the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Technology Pioneer Award. In 2015, the Association of Women Geoscientists Professional Excellence Award. And in 2017, the American Quaternary Association Distinguished Career Award.
Yeah.
Dr. Whitlock is a fellow of the Geological Society of America and AAAS, the American Association for Advancement of Science. And in 2018, she received one of the highest honors a scientist can receive when she was elected to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. But before Kathy became this well-known, world-renowned scientist that she is today, she was also a leader and pioneer on this campus in these very halls. She came to UW to pursue her master's and PhD after completing her undergraduate bachelor's at Colorado College, where when she came to UW, she had an office on the corner, one of those corner offices with all the nice windows on the 3rd floor of Wink. And for her master's and PhD work, she was advised by another world-class scientist and conservationist, Dr. Estella Leopold, who we are also very lucky and honored to have in our audience today, so welcome. I first learned about Kathy's work in Yellowstone because that's where I was doing some similar research, but Kathy's work really spans several corners of the planet, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about that from several different regions today. She asks fascinating and important questions about how past environmental and ecological variability can inform our ideas of resilience today and in the future. I'll admit that as someone who is often labeled as a neo-ecologist, meaning I study things in relatively short recent timescales, I toss around the term resilience without the caution that I probably should, and the caution that I'm reminded by work from people like Kathy, that to really understand resilience, we need to look at broader timescales and spatial scales to really inform where our world is today and where it's going. If you have been lucky enough, as some of us have, to spend some time with Dr. Whitlock, you've also gotten to realize that on top of being an eminent scientist, she's also incredibly humble and approachable, and is one of the nicest people that you'll ever meet, and is an excellent communicator. So we're very, very lucky to hear her share some of her research with us today. So we are incredibly lucky to spend our afternoon today with Kathy. Please join me in a very warm welcome to Dr. Kathy Whitlock.
Can you hear me with this microphone? Well, thanks, Brian. That was really over the top. I'm so glad to be here back at UW, and I thought I'd maybe start my talk today telling you a little bit about myself, and then what's going on in paleoecology, what are some of the interesting advances, and then a little bit about my research and what we're discovering. So let me start first with myself. Let's see. As Brian said, I got my master's and PhD here at University of Washington, and I can't tell you how important this place has been to me through my career. Coming here, I developed my toolkit of research skills. I learned how to think about research and write. I had the opportunity to take classes from absolutely excellent professors. And I also, the network of people I met, both my colleagues, my graduate student colleagues and my professors, have been collaborators through my career. So University of Washington is extremely important to me in my life. I came here from Colorado College, and then when I graduated here, my first position was a postdoc in Ireland, which was great fun. I was at Trinity College, Ireland, and I was working on bogs in the west of Ireland. And then my first real position was a split position. I was at Carnegie Museum of Natural History as a curator in paleobotany, and also had a position at the University of Pittsburgh. I wanted to be out west again, so I took a job at University of Oregon, and I was there till 2004 in the Department of Geography. And then I got the opportunity to move to Montana State University, and so I've been there since 2004, and really enjoyed being back in the Rocky Mountain West, which is where I grew up. The other thing is that I think anyone that has any success in their career really owes it to a lot of people that help them along the way. These are my mentors, this is my constellation of heroes. And these are people, it's no single person, but these are people that along the way in your career give you good advice. They share their ideas, they're very generous with their ideas, and they just are there when you're making important decisions. And so I just wanted to acknowledge these people, too, not in any particular order. But first, Herb Wright, who was a well-known quaternary scientist at the University of Minnesota. I spent quite a bit of time with Herb in the field and at the University of Minnesota, and he really taught me how to write. He was an excellent writer, a prolific writer, and he helped me think about how to ask good questions. You know, what's a good question from a bad question? So I owe a lot to him. He passed away a couple years ago. And then Dave and Jane Love, they're Wyoming. Dave was a Wyoming geologist, worked for the U.S. Geological Survey, and he got me interested in the Yellowstone region as a place to work. But he also made me think about the kinds of questions an ecologist or a paleoecologist could ask about big earth processes, things like mountain building and the influence it might have on ecosystems. And then Bill Watts was my mentor here at University of Washington. He was a visiting professor from Ireland, and then I went and did a postdoc with him. And he just taught me how much fun it is to do field work. There is nothing more fun than going out in a bog and getting completely muddy and getting these amazing cores. Ken Pierce, another geologist with the USGS, has taught me to think critically about the glacial history of places and how you date them, and he's also unfailingly generous with his time with students.
Ken Pierce, right?
Yeah, Ken Pierce. And then last but not least, by any means, was my PhD advisor, Estella Leopold, who I'm lucky enough to have come hear my talk today. Estella really got me interested in paleoecology, and she also showed me that science can have value for real world issues. So she really instilled in me this idea that your science can have conservation relevance, and that's really important. And you can see me there in grad school sampling a core in the basement of Johnson Hall with Stella looking over my shoulders, making me very nervous. Okay, so let me move on to my science. So when you do terrestrial paleoecology, you're really looking at interactions. And for me, the interactions of interest are the relationships between climate and people and how they influence things like fire and vegetation. And each of these bubbles is in itself complex, so when we talk about vegetation, we don't just mean what was there, but what was the structure of that vegetation. When we talk about fire, it's not just the occurrence of fire, but the frequency or the size and the intensity. Climate, it's the climate variability, but also the mean state of climate. And then humans are extremely complicated to think about. And with respect to fire, it's not only whether they start fires, but whether they're putting out fires. In paleoecology, you're trying to understand those arrows. And the interesting thing is that the strength of the arrows and the direction of the arrows really changes depending on the temporal and spatial scale that you're looking at the question. So there is no simple answer, I guess is the short answer. In paleoecology, these are the kinds of questions that get us excited. What are the natural drivers of environmental change? What's the footprint of people? How resilient are ecosystems to change, thinking about long-term change? And then how does the past inform the present or the future? So those are the kinds of things that I would say sort of unify the discipline, is trying to tackle those questions with a long time perspective. There's a bunch of sort of tools that are available to us in paleoecology, and the tool that you grab off the shelf, again, depends on the time scale and the spatial scale that you're interested in looking at. So on really short time scales, but often global, you might look at remote sensing data or documentary records. But then as you go back to slightly longer time scales, you go to tree ring records, and then to lake sediment records, and on up. And we have models that can help us look at processes on different scales. So we work with people that do landscape models or stand models, all the way to Earth systems models. And in the process of doing that, we're considering weather on short time scales, but ultimately long-term climate change. Our group on that shelf takes off lakes. We work on lakes. Lakes are the place for us. And the reason for that is lakes are great repositories of environmental information. The things that are blowing around in the air, when they land on a lake and they sink to the bottom, as long as that lake is operational, it's not dried up, will get buried in the sediments. And so we can go to these lakes and get sediment cores, vertical cores, and we would start at the top. The top would be the present day layer of mud, and go all the way to the bottom of the lake. And the bottom of the lake will be the age when the lake formed. So in Montana, and mostly around here, our lakes formed at the end of the last ice age. So they go back 15,000, 16,000 years ago. And so those are what we work with, these cores of mud. And we take them back to the laboratory, and we slice them open, and we analyze the chemistry of those cores, and we also extract samples, sometimes layer by layer, sometimes at intervals, and process them in the laboratory, and we spend hours looking under the microscope, right? So a student working on a master's in paleoecology may have a couple of glorious days in the field, and then like a year in the lab looking at what's under the microscope. And for us, it's pollen. So pollen is specific to the plant. Once you know the plants, you know the vegetation. Once you know the vegetation, you know the climate. So it's that sequence of steps for us. We also look at particles of charcoal because that tells us about fire occurrence in these lake sediments. And then sometimes we find insect parts, although not very often. And that can tell us about things like insect outbreaks in the past. So conceptually, we're starting for these glacial lakes, we're starting with a landscape like Yellowstone. 20,000 years ago, Yellowstone was completely covered by an ice cap. And we're looking at what happened when the ice left, so about 17,000 years ago. And this is really ground zero in terms of an ecosystem, because once the ice left, there was no soil, there were no plants, there were no lakes, there were no animals. There was nothing. Everything had to form. And so you're looking at the steps ecologically that goes from that landscape to the present day landscape. And then what are the drivers of those changes? Is it climate? Is it people? Is it soil development? That sort of thing. The other big influence in my career, I would say, is the Yellowstone fires of 1988. I had just gotten my first research grant, and it was to collect records for pollen analysis, and I hadn't even thought about all those charcoal particles that were in the mud as well. I just wasn't thinking about fire, didn't cross my mind. I wasn't listening to Estella, who was talking about fire for a long time, but I really wasn't thinking about it. And then the 88 fires came, there was charcoal falling out of the sky, and I realized that fire was a big process that I hadn't even thought about as shaping the history of vegetation. And so we set up a study the year of 1988, but it went on for 10 years. And it was really to try to get a handle on those charcoal particles and be able to better use them to reconstruct fire history. So we looked at lakes we looked at small lakes, all of them, but some of them had watersheds that were burned, and some of them had watersheds that weren't burned. And we went back several times a year and grabbed the surface sediments of those lakes to see how long would it take for charcoal to get into the sediments, so that we might have seen that there was a fire in 1988, how much charcoal was there, how far did it travel, and that sort of thing. And we used the information from that study to really understand sort of how to model fires. And so Phil Higuera and his group, Phil is a graduate student here as well, really developed this very elegant model looking at the different components of charcoal and then measuring how they get into the lakes. But it was sort of founded on some of the empirical studies that we had done. We also were working with people like Pat Bartlein at University of Oregon to try to understand fire climate better, so that we could try to understand the conditions that might lead to fires in the past. So for example, this is NSEP analysis of large fire years in Montana. And what you can see is that the kinds of conditions that give large fires in Montana or places like Yellowstone are quite similar. First of all, you get a very well-developed upper level ridge, which is this green off the northeast Pacific. You get a ring of sinking air developing in the west, shown by this kind of orangey color here. And then you get a really persistent high pressure system off the coast as a result of that. And so when we see periods of a lot of fire, we can imagine that these kinds of circulation conditions were present and maybe even persistent for a long time. So now around the world, people are using some of the methods that we developed in Yellowstone to develop fire history studies. So there's sort of now a community of charcoalologists, I guess, charcoal people, to look at charcoal in lake sediments and wetlands. And we all do it kind of the same way, which is important. We all pick the same size of lake. We all collect sediment pretty much the same way and sample contiguously in the same way. We either use sieving or image analysis to identify charcoal. We quantify the data. We calculate and interpret those data in a fairly similar way. And so it's really been gratifying. There's now a publicly available global charcoal database with about 900 charcoal records around the world. So you can see it's got very good coverage in North America, pretty good coverage in South America, not good coverage in Africa or parts of Asia, but pretty good coverage where there are lakes in Australia. And this charcoal database gets interrogated for all kinds of interesting questions. For example, I don't know if you know, but there's a debate about whether there was a comet that impacted the Laurentide ice sheet, North America at the end of the last ice age, and maybe led to a large-scale cooling, the Younger Dryas cooling. Well, we could go to the charcoal database and see if, in fact, there were more fires that would show that there was a dramatic climate change event, and actually suggest that there wasn't a dramatic climate change event. People look at use these records to see what the influence of people is. The influence of people on a local or regional or global scale. So it's a very important set of information. Okay, so let me go to Yellowstone and tell you what we're thinking about in Yellowstone. We have this network of sites of pollen and charcoal records that goes from north to south, and it includes high elevation and low elevation records. And we can look at how fire, for example, has changed in Yellowstone. So here's 15,000 years of fire record that I'm going to show you. Let me first start with the temperature record. So this is based on paleoclimate modeling, and it shows that in the last 10,000 years, there's been sort of steady cooling, and it's gotten warmer towards the present. Here's the fire history data from all of those sites composited into a single record, and you can see that during this period, there's way more fires in Yellowstone. This was the time when we know summers were warmer and drier than today. And there's been sort of a decline in fires. There's a few kind of ups and downs in that, but a general decline in fires, and then you rise to the 1988 fire. So if you look at the 1988 fires in context, if we look at all the 20th century records, this is low fire activity and high fire activity. There haven't been very many fires like 1988 in the 20th century, really none. Here's where all the 20th century charcoal data fall out. Here's the last 2,500 years. Still 1988 is kind of a rare event. Most of the fires are much smaller. You really have to go back 15,000 years for 1988 to really fall in the distribution of fire occurrence. And it's these fires out here that are the high fires like 1988. So that gives you a temporal perspective on a really extraordinary event that we've seen in our lifetime, and we're using paleoecology to sort of give it some context. And so I would argue, let me show you something. So this is the fire history record again, and we also can do similar things with the vegetation history. So as I just showed you, in the past, we've had more fires during this period. But this is fantastic. This is postdoc worked on this. This is the vegetation reconstruction for the greater Yellowstone area. So this is low elevation to high elevation, 15,000 years ago to present. And these are the different forest types in Yellowstone based on pollen data going through time. Now the purple color is telling you where the vegetation types that have no modern analog. They're very different than anything today. So you can see that until about 12,000 years ago, from high to low, most of the vegetation was very dissimilar to what we see today. And then after 12,000, you start to get the modern vegetation. So you have this evidence of novel communities being a very strong signal in Yellowstone at the end of the last ice age. The other thing you see in these pollen records is there's periods of a lot of stability. So here's the lodgepole pine forest in central Yellowstone. It formed about 10,000 years ago, and it hasn't really changed very much since then. But you also see at lower elevation, there's sort of a flickering of analog and no analog vegetation that goes on. So some parts of the ecosystem are fairly stable, and other parts are showing a lot of change. And the final thing, and I don't quite know what to make of it, but the pollen record suggests that in the past, there was more forest cover than there is today. So today, the pollen reconstruction puts the steppe all the way up to this elevation and the tundra all the way down to this elevation. So it's a very compressed forest zone compared to what we see going back in time. Okay, so I do think these records help us understand resilience. So if you go to this sort of classic cup and ball picture, you can think of this as being an adaptive landscape, and this is our present day ecosystem, which is represented by that ball. And yeah, sure, if you make it a little bit drier, you'll push the ball this way. If you make it a little wetter, you'll push the ball that way. So you can think about that being the present. But what if you push the ball to the extent that it crosses over this threshold and then it hits a shallow cup, and that's not very stable, and you come to this cup, and so on, and finally we get into this. That's what paleoecology can tell you about. It can give you that broader perspective. So, in neoecology, I guess if I'll borrow your term, we spend a lot of time in that one place, that one cup. Paleoecology lets us look at other dimensions of the ecosystem. And so I would argue it helps us really expand our time horizons. Okay, I wanted to give you 3 examples of places where we've been working and ask this sort of question of what's natural And this is where paleoecology can give us some insights. And I want to give you 3 examples. One is the oak forests in Sicily. The second is the beech forests, beech podocarp forests in New Zealand. And the last one is the white pine forests in Yellowstone. So why did I choose these? Well, if you think about present landscapes, you can see that there are a variety of conditions. So you can have a landscape that's looking fairly pristine, meaning that it's sort of operating in its natural capacity, including with indigenous people on it, to very, very altered landscapes. And I would argue that Yellowstone's white bark pine forest is in that sort of near pristine. You know, we're looking at basically ecosystem processing functioning as they always have. New Zealand is more of a mosaic type of landscape where you have some natural and some not natural. And Sicily is this incredibly altered landscape of agricultural land. So the first example, I want to talk about the evergreen oaks in Sicily. So this is a tree that has a distribution along the Mediterranean and completely grew in Sicily for a long time, but it's now very, very restricted. Evergreen oaks, you would hardly find them at all. You find them in a few protected areas, but mostly they're completely gone. And so the question is, what's happened to the evergreen oaks, and what can we do about it? Okay, pollen records can tell us about the history of those evergreen oaks. So this is work by Willie Tinner, my colleague, and it goes back to 8,000 BC or 10,000 years ago. And this green curve here, going towards the present, is the evergreen oak. And what you can see is that before about 7,000 years ago, there wasn't much oak, but then the climate became good for it, and it colonized Sicily. This is that, let me back up, this is that, a core from that lake. It colonized around that lake and was dominant vegetation along with some other shrubs. And then about 2,000 years ago, evergreen oak was clobbered and almost completely disappeared from the record. Well, that happened in the Roman times. The Romans came in, logged, clear-cut, used the land for agriculture, and that was pretty much the end of evergreen oak as a major tree on the island. So what would it take to bring evergreen oak back? Well, that's where we go to modeling. And if we use the present climate and we run a landscape model, land climb, what we can see is that if we reduce disturbance, that is, we didn't burn it and we didn't have grazing, indeed we could bring evergreen oak back. So here's a low disturbance model, and it shows that going into the future you could bring evergreen oak back. And even if you had some level of disturbance, some burning and some agriculture, you still could bring it back. The problem is that when you look at the future climate, where it's getting warmer and drier going into the future, you really can't bring evergreen oak back. No matter how hard you try with no disturbance or moderate disturbance, the climate for evergreen oak is just not going to allow it to establish. So what's the management recommendations? Well, from a paleoecology perspective, we can see that the demise of this tree was driven by centuries of land use. It really was the Romans and the medieval period that eliminated it. We also can see that from modeling that it has the potential to be restored under the current climate if we can suppress disturbance, fire, and grazing. But it's unlikely to survive in the future. It will survive farther north in the Mediterranean, but not in Sicily. So I would argue for managers and conservation planners, the message is maybe it's not worth putting a lot of effort into trying to save evergreen oak on Sicily. It's just not going to be a suitable place, and the sort of costs of doing it are too great. Okay, the second example is this mosaic landscape. This is specifically the southern beech podocarp forest in New Zealand. Now, 3,000 years ago, New Zealand looked like this. It was completely forested except for this white area, which are glaciers. But New Zealand was completely forested. When the Europeans came, half of it was not forested. The forest was gone. And we've been doing a lot of work on the South Island to try to understand what happened that led to the demise of the forest in New Zealand. And the answer is pretty simple. It's people. We know almost exactly the year when people arrived, 1280 AD, and I'm happy to tell you how we know that so accurately. But we know that people arrived, they were Polynesians, they came in very low densities, and they were basically hunter-gatherers and had small gardens. From lake sediment records in New Zealand, so this is present day going back to about 1000 AD. Here's the arrival of people as this band, and here's the series of lakes and their charcoal records. And what you see is that before people came, there was almost no fire in New Zealand. Really very, very uncommon. People came, and there was a lot of burning. There's this initial burning period in New Zealand, and it kind of lasts, it varies from lake to lake, but it lasts from about 1300 to 1500 AD. And then there's a quiet period with very little burning, and then the Europeans come in 1850, and there's some renewed burning that goes on. So what we see from the pollen record is that in less than 100 years at any particular site, there's a complete deforestation event on South Island, New Zealand, on the eastern half. So we go from this kind of vegetation to more of a grassland, shrubland kind of vegetation. So why is that? What made this forest so vulnerable? Well, southern beech podocarp forests have traits that are really make them poorly adapted to fire. They have thin bark, whereas our conifers have thick bark that survive fire. They have roots that are very shallow and near the surface. They're very susceptible to root rot if they get injured, the roots get injured. They have no ability to resprout, which is a very strong fire adaptation for conifers. They have very heavy seeds. They disperse a short distance, so it's very hard for them to be colonized. And they don't produce a persistent seed bank. And work that's been done by Alan Tepley and Tom Veblen and others kind of creates this story. So what happens in New Zealand is when you have a fire, the first thing that comes back are these really scabby barked shrub trees, manuka and canuka. And they're highly flammable, as you can just see from their bark. And so once they get set up, you tend to stay in this loop where they just keep propagating and becoming more abundant. It takes about 300 years of no fire to get a beech forest back. And so what we think is that people were deliberately setting fires on these really flammable shrubby areas, and in that way eating away steadily and fairly rapidly at the beech forest until it was gone. So most of the forests in New Zealand were human generated. The types that are in New Zealand, the forest types, the canopy trees, evolved in the absence of fire. Before people came, there was really very little fire in New Zealand. There's not a good mechanism for natural ignitions. You get, because of the kind of vegetation in New Zealand, you get these positive feedbacks and flammability that keep leading to rapid forest loss. And in fact, we're seeing that in South America as well with those southern beech forests. That's happening right now. So the management message, I would say, based on paleoecology is that if you want to keep the remnants that you have of podocarp beech forest, you really have to put out fires. You really have to stop fires. So fire suppression in this kind of setting is probably the best strategy from a conservation point of view. Okay, so I've shown you two examples. So here's our pristine to our intensely altered landscape. And this is the last 8,000 years of history. In Sicily, we're looking at an example where people have steadily altered the landscape more and more and more through their land use practices, starting with the Neolithic and the Bronze Age and the Roman Age into the modern. And so you're left with this very altered landscape, and that sets you off in a particular conservation trajectory. In the case of New Zealand, you certainly had a very pristine, I would say completely pristine landscape till 1280 AD when people arrived, and then suddenly we went to a mosaic condition. So what about Yellowstone? Okay, so I'm not saying Yellowstone is completely pristine or even near pristine. It's got multiple uses. It's used for agriculture, and it's managed forests and so on. But at its core, it actually is pretty much in a natural system. And we know people were here for 12,000 years maybe, as much as that, and they were certainly using the landscape. But I don't think they were altering it in ways that climate wasn't taking it already. So I'm not taking people out of the equation, but I just think they're really part of the ecosystem. In Yellowstone, I would put in this thing. It's in a kind of a near pristine condition all the way to the present day. Okay, so let me talk about white pines. White pines are really having a tough time, as Brian knows. Right now, they're getting clobbered by white pine blister rust. They've been attacked by a mountain pine beetle. There have been a lot of fires. And we know that white pines in the West are really important food sources and play a very important ecosystem role. They're the favorite food of grizzly bears and red squirrels and Clark's nutcrackers and so on. And so there's an effort in the West right now to maybe even plant genetically resistant trees and trying to even list them as an endangered species. Another thing that's happening with whitebark pine is that the climate is changing. And so mostly whitebark pine is dominant in high elevations. And as the climate gets warmer and warmer, the likelihood of having suitable space gets less and less. So this is the probability of occurrence today, and then this is the end of the century. You can see it has very little habitat left in a warmer climate. I include both white pines because we honestly, in the pollen record, we can't tell them apart. So we have whitebark pine growing at high elevation, but we also have limber pine at low elevation, and limber pine is suffering from the same stresses of drought, bark beetles, and blister rust. But we can kind of infer what their history is. So let me just show you. Here's another diagram from Yellowstone, from our sites going from low elevation to high elevation from 15,000 years to present. And this is the density of white pine through time and space based on pollen data. And so it looks to us like whitebark pine came in early on at kind of low elevations. That's where the colors start to get darker. Then it moved up higher as the climate got warmer. And then there was a time period when there was whitebark pine at low elevations and also at high elevations, which is really interesting. And I should say whitebark limber pine because you can't separate them. And then in the last 6,000 years, I think you're starting to see the separation of limber pine growing at low elevations and whitebark pine at high elevations. Okay, so we took those records of white pine. Here they are. Here's all the pollen records of white pine. And we summarized them using a GANS analysis. So here's the sort of trend through time in white pine based on these data. And what I want to point out, again, is this period when we seem to have more white pines in the past than we do now. We can compare that to various other data sets. So here's the record of summer temperature at the top, and here's this period of high white pine. So here's that hump in white pine right there. It's occurring at a time of higher temperature. It's also occurring at a time when we previously had a lot of spruce, Engelmann spruce, but Engelmann spruce is on the decline. And so it's almost as if when Engelmann spruce starts to decline because it's getting too warm, white pines are starting to come in. It's a time of high fire. White pines seem to do fine when there's more fire activity than today. And the decline of white pine at the end of the record seems to be related to the increase in lodgepole pine. And lodgepole pine is a very much a competitive species with white pines today. So going to my management recommendations again, I would say we know that white pines had a wider range and a niche in the past than I would say most bioclimatic models consider today. It seems to have done well when there were more fires and summers were warmer in the past. The one difference between that past period and today is there were cooler winters at that time, and that may be the difference. It seems to be limited by competition, so it didn't come in until spruce declined, and it left when lodgepole pine came in. So I'm much more of an optimist than a lot of people. I think we see that white pines have had a broad range, and they've tolerated a lot of conditions, and maybe we should have some faith that this tree will do okay, at least, but we need to keep an eye on it, and we need to let fires happen, but we need to be monitoring it. So these approaches, just to summarize, I think give some ideas on how you might approach conservation. So when you're looking at pristine landscapes like Yellowstone, your objectives really should be to manage for the historical range of variability. That's the kind of thing that paleo information can give you, and that's a very important piece of information going forward. When you're in these altered landscapes, maybe your values should be different, and you should be instead managing for cultural or heritage benefits, not for the natural range of variability. They're already so highly altered. And it's those mosaic landscapes in between, I think, that are the real challenge, because there you have the capacity to manage for some parts of the landscape with historical range of variability, but you also have a lot of altered landscapes. Okay, just to wrap this up, relating to the past, how does the past relate to the future, given we're moving into this crazy new space? And I just show you a couple of diagrams here. This one came out last year in Nature, and it's a compilation of pollen diagram data from Europe and North America. And it's going back 11,000 years, here's present, and it's showing you the temperature history. And so what you can see is at the end of the glacial period, there's this really rapid rise in temperature, and then in the last 7,000 years, there's been kind of a cooling in temperature. That's what the pollen data show us. The interesting thing is the average of the last 11,000 years is here. The temperature average of the last decade of this data is here, and 2016 is here, right? So we're 99.4% warmer than any of the temperature reconstructions that we've seen for the last 11,000 years. So that's worrisome. We're definitely moving into uncharted territory. Okay, we have a lot of people in the community work on ice core records, and you've seen this. Here's the CO2 record going back 800,000 years ago. Here's the temperature record. When you have warmer temperatures, you have higher CO2, and it's fluctuated up and down over the last 800,000 years. And it's fluctuated within a very prescribed range of variability. But now we're here. We're at 410 parts per million. And so I ask myself, well, how far back do you have to go in time to get to 410 parts per million of CO2? And the story is changing, but here's the last 800,000 years of ice core data here. And this is an ocean record from the equatorial Atlantic showing you temperature for the last 5 million years. So it's warm and it's getting steadily cooler and cooler, and the variability is increasing until you get to the present day. You have to go to about 3.5, 4 million years ago to get CO2 levels that are 415 parts per million. And that's a very different world. It's about 6.5 degrees warmer than today. It's extremely warm at the poles, 18 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. We don't have a Greenland ice sheet, so it's 25 meters higher at sea level. And there's parts of Montana, I'd say, that look more like South Carolina today. There's more. When you look at the pollen record from this period, you get many more broadleaf species. So it doesn't mean we couldn't live in that kind of a world, but it would be a different world, that's for sure. We just finished doing a climate assessment for Montana, looking into the future. And no surprise to anybody, but it shows that by mid-century we're going to be somewhere between 4 to even 7.5 degrees warmer. So these are the different parts of Montana, and here's the months, January through December, and the darkness is showing you which seasons are the warmest. And what you see in Montana is that it's warmer both in summer and winter, especially though in summer. The big impact that we're going to see in our region is the shift from snow to rain. Here's some data from the Yellowstone region. So this is 1950 going to the end of the century. Green is the elevation of rain, so you can see where we are now. Blue is the elevation of snow, and sort of orange and red are the elevations where you get that slush, like you guys get a lot, that like horrible slush. And here's a map of Yellowstone, present, going into the future, and what you see is now a pretty familiar story. We're getting less snow, more rain and slush. We're going to have more days over 90 degrees going into the future. By mid-century, maybe even a month more of days over 90 degrees. And this is really going to exacerbate drought in a state that's largely agriculture. Okay, so getting back to my point about history, is history any more relevant? And famous paleoecologist, ethnologist Ed Deavy at Yale said, when time is required to see a result, there's no substitute for history. And Winston Churchill, in a context that I cannot find out, but it's a well-known quote by him, said the longer you can look back, the farther you can look forward. So these are very much, like history is relevant, yes. But then you have Henry Ford, who I think is taking the more modernist view, that maybe history is more or less bunk. In other words, we're leaving the space of history. And I think, as a paleoecologist, I think history offers suggests there's going to be both challenges and opportunities. And I'm talking mainly about my area of Montana here. We're going to have to learn to live with wildfires. That's going to be a challenge. And we all know the wildfire season's gotten longer. Fires seem to be getting more severe. The way trees and things that come in after fire seems to be changing. And we're just going to get more fires and a longer fire season. The paleo record shows this really nicely. This is a combination of charcoal and tree ring data that go back about 1,400 years. This is the fire record of high and low fire going back to the present. And the gray line is the temperature reconstruction. And what you can see is that fires over this time period have always tracked temperature. So in the medieval period, medieval climate anomaly, there were more fires, it was warmer. The Little Ice Age, it was colder, less fires. But look what's happening now. The number of fires has decreased because of management and landscape fragmentation and so on, but the temperature is getting warmer. And this then becomes a fire deficit. So even as it gets warmer, we're way behind in the amount of area that should be burning if we're staying in equilibrium. And this is happening around the world, right? We're having record fires in Australia right now. We've seen it all over the West, especially California. It's not just a local story. The other thing is we're going to have to live with ecological change. Things are going to be moving. Animals are going to be moving. Trees are going to be changing their ranges, and we've got to live in a world that accommodates movement of wildlife. That's just what's going to happen. As these things try to stay in equilibrium with climate, we need to ensure that there's more connectivity. And we need to live with uncertainty, right? In Montana, we're going to see a much shorter winter season. That's really hard on our economies that depend on snow as a form of tourism. We're going to see warmer, longer summers, and as we're seeing even now, we're going to have more climate surprises, more extreme weather, more extreme cold, more floods, more droughts. In Montana, the big wake-up call was the 2017 drought. That really took people by surprise, and they call it a flash drought because of the speed at which we went from being warm and wet in the early summer to being warm and dry in about a week. Led to big fires, it led to crop failures, it led to livestock loss. Okay, so I think the opportunity, in conclusion then, is that we still have large, intact ecosystems, and we really have to conceptualize and think about how we're going to view these large intact ecosystems. And these are places like Yellowstone and Glacier and Rainier are big national parks. You know, in one sense, they're going to be museums of things of the past, right? Because the world's changing, and the land use around these areas is intensely developing. And so if we want to see what an undeveloped landscape, a near pristine landscape is, these intact ecosystems are going to be the place to go. But they're reservoirs of diversity, too. Every time we take a cup of hot water from a geothermal basin in Yellowstone, we find thousands of new species. You know, it's amazing. And these ecosystems still have the native population of cutthroat trout and grizzly bears and wolves and so on. They're laboratories of change. This figure just came out last week, showing where Yellowstone Park would move based on temperature alone in the future. So here's Yellowstone. Here's where they say it's going to be mid-century and end of century. Here's the Grand Canyon, mid-century, end century. I don't know if that's right. I think it might be right for temperature. I don't know if it's right for moisture, but it's still pretty dramatic. We are looking at changes, and what we don't know right now, and what we think about a lot, is are we changing the fire regime? Are we seeing a big fire regime change in these places, the likes of which we haven't seen? And then ultimately, these places are just places of inspiration and education. It's a place, the opportunity really is to use these places to get people thinking about the planet and our role as global citizens. So thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, thanks, Kathy. We've got about eight minutes or so for questions before we break into the sort of meet and greet part of this, where there'll be more time for questions. But why don't we open it up the floor for 8 minutes or so?
Yeah, we can hit the lights too if you want, if somebody wants to grab those and flip them. Yes?
The last time there were 14 parts million CO2 back, I think you said 3.5 million years ago. Was that due mostly to volcanism? Where was the CO2 coming from?
Well, it wasn't an ice age world, so the world was just generally warmer then. And so, you know, it wasn't being stored so much in the ocean. It wasn't really due to volcanism. It was just more of a CO2 world. There was more, yeah. Yes?
I have a question regarding like restoration. Now that we have like all this climate changes happening, I feel like we'll have more disturbances and there will be like more restoration projects. But when we like restore ecosystem, like what do you think would be like the future? Do you want to restore like the native landscape, or do you think it's better to restore a landscape that's like more resilient towards climate change?
Yeah, you've touched on a big debate, I think, in the conservation community. So, I mean, I think you want to restore a process, first of all, right? If you want to have a functioning ecosystem at whatever level, you want to restore the processes as best you can. But I think it really goes to that heart of how altered is that landscape. You know, what's the capacity of that landscape to be restored? That would be the first question I would have. If it's already a highly altered landscape, you can't really restore it to a more natural condition anyway. So I don't think there's a blanket answer to that. I think, but you need to know something about the past, I think, to look forward to the future. Yeah.
For those elevation, time, abundance plots.
Do you like those?
Yeah. I'm curious, how do you pinpoint the occurrence of, especially like a pine colony, to a particular elevation, given that they might be blowing down?
So those vegetation reconstructions are based on calibration with modern pollen data. So we have this suite of 100, I think it's over 100 modern pollen samples that tell us what the pollen assemblage is and how that relates to the modern vegetation. And then we use those relationships in a statistical way to reconstruct the past. So we're not just looking at the presence of a single pollen grain. And you're absolutely right. The big problem in reconstructing vegetation is there's so much pollen blowing around on the landscape that it's really taken us a while to kind of get our heads around how we would go about making a reconstruction.
I was curious about those unique assemblages in the pollen or in that same graphic. You notice these flares. So those are mostly extant species, or are those also species that you don't see anymore?
No, they're just different combinations of species that we see now. So the big purple no analog thing is a period when we get a spruce parkland. So there's no fir and there's no white bark pine. It's just spruce. And it seems like, for example, spruce was one of the first trees to get into a lot of the Rocky Mountains. And you just find this parkland vegetation that has no competing conifers. And then the little flashes are just odd combinations that didn't draw from any of our modern analogs. Now, it might be there's an analog somewhere else in North America, but from our data set, it didn't have a modern analog. And it's funny how it shows up at the low elevations. I think those low elevation communities are super dynamic. Those lower forests just flicker between being steppe and parkland and forest through time, and sometimes you get combinations that you don't see today. Yeah.
When you're talking about like the mosaic landscapes or whatever, like New Zealand or whatever, what are some other examples of that kind of archetype?
What would you say it is around here?
What would I say around here? What it would be?
Yeah, I think it'd be kind of a mosaic.
Sure.
You have patches of natural, but you also have large areas that are not, or have been altered significantly. You might put it there. I think actually most of our landscapes are kind of a mosaic or tend to be really more altered in some places than others, and that's why I think those large intact ecosystems are just so important. Yes?
Can your research help inform the public about the benefits from these large ecosystems, the ecosystem services?
Yeah, well, I think ecosystem services are a big function of, big benefit of having intact ecosystems, for sure. Clean water, clean air, timber, wild biodiversity, yeah. I think I should mention that more, I should emphasize that more, yeah.
If you're trying to get the public to think, yeah, that would be something to think about.
Yeah.
When you are trying to provide recommendations, how do you deal with the challenge of separating limber pine from white bark? Because I would think that those would really have quite different, if you're making recommendations to managers, your recommendations those would be quite different.
Yeah, I've kind of put limber pine into the Yellowstone story, but I actually think most of the pollen is white bark through the history, because we find needles of white bark pine as we're in those pollen records. We don't find limber pine. But limber pine is there, and it's in this part of the Rockies, it's a pretty minor component, but it's definitely a low elevation species. And then, so I was struggling with that because I can't really eliminate it, but I don't think it's really what's contributing to the pollen, because we have macrophosphus of white bark pine. But I also think it doesn't change the story too much, because they're all getting clobbered by the same things. So it's blister rust, and it's bark beetle, and it's climate.
So that big area, sort of here in your diagram, there's a lot of yellow sort of at the bottom of that one graph. I was assuming that was limber pine, but you're saying it wasn't, huh?
You mean the white bark pine story?
Yeah, the white bark pine story, we had a big graph with darker and lighter yellow, orange,
Let's see if I can pull it up.
about 40 slides ago.
It was green, this thing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you don't think that,
I think I think that I can't separate. I'm thinking a lot of that's white bark pine, but I can't tell you for sure. Even these sites, we get needles of white bark pine in them, but that doesn't mean that all of the pollen is from white bark pine.
but the patches you've got farther over, a little bit to the right there, is that
That.
most likely limber? No, up to the right, to the
Oh,
direction.
sorry. Okay. Back.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, at this point, I think at some point you're starting to get, you've got to get the low elevation and the high elevation separated, and it looks like it's happening at that time period. That's kind of when the modern climate gets set up too.
And one other question. What did New Zealand look like during the early Pleistocene?
You know, it was largely tundra, kind of a shrubland tundra.
Sorry, the early post-Pleistocene, the early Holocene, sorry.
Oh, the early
Holocene,
Holocene.
yes.
Yeah, well, let me start with the glacial period. We know that the beaches and the podocarps were there. They didn't arrive from somewhere else. So they're very restricted in the canyons, probably just a very minor part of a largely treeless vegetation. And then you have this big infusion of both those trees. You have podocarps and Vegetation showing up in the early Holocene.
So there's no evidence of fire even in the dry early Holocene?
The very driest parts of New Zealand show some low levels of charcoal in the bogs, but most of the bogs have no charcoal. It's really interesting. It's one place you can go on the planet where you can really try to separate the impact of people from the impact of climate.
And one final question, and then we'll bring
Yeah.
it to the party.
So since you're looking back thousands of years in areas where natives were, do you ever incorporate any traditional knowledge or things like that, or does any native use of the land ever show up in your cores?
I do consider it, but I think most of the use of fire, for example, was pretty local by early people. So we know they were hunter-gatherers, and they could well have used fire in a lot of these Rocky Mountain systems to maintain ecosystems. But when we're near an archaeological site, we might see elevated levels of charcoal, but we won't see that same signal farther away from the site. So I think their use of fire was pretty local. We see that same thing in South America. It's different than the people's story in New Zealand. Yeah, and we never see a situation where the climate gets warmer and you get less fires because people were somehow suppressing them. You know, fire is always tracking climate, so it could be that people were starting the fires, but they weren't taking the system in a different direction than the climate would have taken it, if that makes sense.
All right, well, it's 4:30.